So we're starting to approach two things now. One is Hegel's account of motion, and one is the argument for dialetheism. So let's take Hegel first. I think we talked a bit about Hegel's account of motion a few weeks ago, and we're back in the same territory now. So Hegel gives his account of motion in the Logic, and of course he's writing before Russell, but he's well aware of the kind of Russellian account, and he's critical of it. And what he says is this: to be in motion is not to be here at one time and here at another time, because things can be stationary at both points, so not in motion. To be in motion is for the here, for it to be here and not here at one and the same time, and that's a contradiction, of course. So what is Hegel thinking when he says this? Well, what he's thinking is this: if you're Hegel, there is an intrinsic state of motion. There is an intrinsic state of becoming. And when you get something in motion and take an instant of that motion, because the thing has this intrinsic state of becoming, it's kind of moving, but that means even though it's in an instant, it's already gone a little bit further, or maybe it hasn't quite got there yet. So the thing in motion will realize a contradiction. It's here, but because it's in motion, it's already gone a little bit further. So it's not there, it's somewhere else. So that's Hegel's account of motion. It endorses a theory of intrinsic states of motion, and if that account is right, it gives you an argument for dialetheism about motion. How does it solve Zeno's paradoxes? Well, in a very different way, because what you're saying is that if you consider this instant of motion, because the thing's in motion, at that instant, it's already got a little bit further. So progress made at an instant is non-zero. It's already gone a little bit further. So if progress made at an instant is non-zero, then you can simply add up all these non-zero things to get something that's non-zero. And you don't need to worry about measure theory or adding infinite number of zeros because you're never dealing with zero. Okay, so that's Hegel, that's his account. That's how it provides an argument for dialetheism if you endorse that account. And then we're back to this question of whether you prefer Russell's account or Hegel's account. And you know, the bits of mathematics involved in both cases are kind of straightforward. So I don't think this is going to be solved in mathematical terms. It's going to be resolved, if at all, by something much more fundamental. Our understanding of which bit of mathematics it makes most sense to apply.
Okay, and before we expand a bit more on your personal Hegelian account of motion, this is something that we've already discussed some years ago when we met in Brasilia, and the worry I had, and I still have about your view, is that even admitting a spread of positions over which the tip of the arrow might be at an instant, the spread is located where it is, in a sense. So my worry is about you calling it an advancement, and how are you not back to the same problem when you ask yourself how this inconsistent spread of positions at an instant is supposed itself to advance, because it has to advance, otherwise the the arrow would be just stuck in a little spread of positions forever. But if it has to advance, then it seems like you're back again with the same problem, right? The whole spread must advance by at an instant. The spread makes zero advancement, and again, so the Hegelian version of the arrow is, well, how does the spread manage to reach the target?
Sure. Well, look, it depends what you think the exact problem is. It's not quite accurate to say how does the spread reach the target. I mean, it's the arrow that reaches the target. Okay. And if your problem is how it does that, the answer is because it makes an advance on its journey in an instant. Okay. If that's your problem, then this account solves it. Now, maybe there are other problems which it doesn't solve. So let's think a bit more carefully about this. What you're raising is essentially a second order problem. Okay. So just as the arrow moves from point to point, the spread of its occupation is also going to move from point to point. That's true. Is that a problem? Look, I'm not sure that it is, but if there's a problem there, it's obviously a second order problem. And it seems to me that just as you have a first order solution to the arrow paradox, you can do exactly the same for the second order problem. So if you've got the worry about spreads themselves moving, then you're going to have spreads of spreads. And you're going to tell exactly the same story about that. So just as the mathematics of points occupied is going to be inconsistent, so the mathematics of spreads occupied, so to speak, is going to be inconsistent. And then, of course, you're going to have exactly the same problem with respect to that, and off you go in an infinite hierarchy. So if there's a problem here, it's not the same as the original problem, which was solving Zeno's arrow. It's going to be a meta problem, as it were. And I think the meta solution to the meta problem is exactly the same as the solution to the problem.
One thing that I like about your solution is that unlike any other that I know of, can be straightforwardly applied to the case of passage. In standard understandings of motion, it is very hard to pin down exactly what it is about time itself that changes, right? It seems nearly contradictory to ask how can time itself change when change is precisely having different states at a different time. And it seems like your view has this advantage that it can be just straightforwardly applied to the case of temporal becoming. Could you expand on that? You wrote a paper particularly on that, but you suggested this already in your first formulations. Could you expand a bit on how the Hegelian view is supposed to apply to temporal becoming?
Yeah. Okay. So objects move, and that's some kind of change. It's in a state of flux with respect to its position. But you're absolutely right that we talk about time itself as being in a state of flux. And we certainly have this phenomenological feeling that time is flowing as I speak now, I can sort of feel it flowing past me in some phenomenological sense. And the question is how to explain that phenomenology. Many people have reflected on this and concluded that the talk of time itself changing is incoherent. Time is what measures change. To speak of time itself changing is just a nonsense. Okay, fine. That's a line that was endorsed by Grunbaum and Smart and Meller and so on. But then you have the problem of explaining the phenomenology. And the standard line here is that this is an illusion. There is no flux of time. The flux of time is just an illusion produced by the fact that the brain is in one state at one time and another state at another time. Okay. You might worry about how plausible an analysis of the phenomenology of time this is. It's kind of convenient to say it's an illusion, but leaves you feeling a bit dissatisfied with this, right?
Don't you find I sometimes think that the view is more than inconvenient. It's self-undermining, because I mean, you at this point you're supposed to make various mistakes at different times and various illusions. You're having different illusions at different times, but now a sort of Cartesian argument kicks in, because there must be a flux of illusions then, and now it is hard to claim that you're deluded about your own illusions. I mean, you could, of course. Daniel Dennett went that way. But I find it really even more implausible than the simple misperception view, let's say, that McTaggart, for example, seemed to have had.
Yeah. Okay. So you're dead right. I mean, there have to be not only first-order illusions, but there have to be second-order illusions about illusions, and so on all the way up, right? Yeah. I don't feel very comfortable with that position. I suspect that those who endorse this view would just bite the bullet and say, well, that's, you have to live with that. So, I mean, are there other accounts? So this takes us back to a previous stage in the conversation where I talked about when you have rival accounts, I mean, how do you choose between them? And one thing you might worry about is saving the phenomena. Use this old-fashioned way of describing theories, which, I mean, any scientific theory is going to have to say that some things are just wrong. But it's a better theory if it saves the phenomena more. You can do justice, you can recognize the phenomena and not write them off. And we talked a bit about this in context of the feeling that change is something dynamic. There's a genuine dynamic of flux. And now we've reached the same point with respect to time itself, because we all have this phenomenology of the flux of time. And the thought that time does not change doesn't save those phenomena very well. You really have to take these things to be illusions. And then you come back to the question of whether there's an account that does save the phenomena. What you sort of hinted at just now is the way you might be able to do that by applying the sort of dialethic theory of change to time itself. And I think you can certainly do that. I think there are issues with it, but as a first cut, it's something like this. Just as with the point of the arrow, you've got to assume that its position is where it is and is not where it is, because it's gone a little bit further. So by analogy with that, if you consider time itself, then time is where it is, but it also isn't where it is because it's gone a little bit further. And it's the fact that, having gone this a little bit further, is to be in an intrinsic state of change. And so there's an intrinsic sort of flux of these quantities, which are contradictory, means that time itself, if it instantiates this kind of contradiction, is in a dynamic state of flux. And that's really what lies behind this phenomenology of the flux of time. You're really grasping this inconsistent state of time itself, just because an inconsistent state really is a flux state. So that's sort of cashing out your thought about how you might approach this problem of the flux of time by applying this sort of account of flux states in general to time itself.